Well, good morning. I'm Bo Grice. I am a local pastor and a local professional counselor as well. But what I want to do today is give you just a quick overview of a method of biblical interpretation that can greatly increase the likelihood that you'll get it right. Because the Bible is divinely inspired. I believe that wholeheartedly. But our interpretations are not. And many times we may uh, walk away from reading a passage and actually have the wrong interpretation of the passage. Or we may be close, but as far as in the right neighborhood, but we're nowhere near the house. So these four steps I want to give you will greatly increase the likelihood that you get it right. And so it follows a very simple acronym, CALM, or CALM. And I used to tell students, you can be calm interpreting the Bible. Now, why is that important? Why is it important to interpret the Bible correctly? Because if you don't, then you put your confidence in something that isn't true. And when it isn't true, it's not going to happen. It's kind of like making a promise out of a verse, but that verse was never intended for you. And that's another part of this too. We have to depersonalize the text because the writers of the original um, text did not write with us in mind. We were not the primary audience. There was a primary audience, but it wasn't us. So we need to depersonalize ourselves from the text and extract the meaning from the text. The big word there is exegete. We need to practice sound exegesis and get the meaning from the text. And then after we know the meaning of the text, then we can decide if it applies to us. So let's look at COM. C. C stands for context. There's two types. There's internal context and external context. The external context is what's going on around the writing of the text. So historical, political, economic, whatever it is that's going on that inspired the writer to write, that would fall under the external context. What was going on in the audience that he wrote to, something had to be happening to encourage him to write, because most of the time they didn't write just to write something. The internal context is what's going on in the passage itself. So don't isolate verse 10 without reading the verses before it and the verses after it. Sometimes if you're using New King James, they'll give you a little help there because they'll use a lot of connecting words like therefore, but, because, and things like that. That will kind of tip you off. Newer translations don't do that so much, so it's a little bit more difficult with them. All right, so C, context, external, internal. All right, the next one is A. A stands for author audience. Now, the author audience thing is important because the author of the book wrote in a particular style. Now, for example, if you look in Paul's writings tend to be a little academicish. And that's because his background was academia. Now, he was a Pharisee, but Pharisees were pretty well educated. And that, in fact, they ran a lot of schools in Israel. So he had a strong background in academia, and he wrote like one. John was different. He didn't do that. John was almost like a poet. Not that he wrote rhyme and verse, but that he used a lot of imagery to convey a message. Now, John did it for a reason, and that has to do with the audience. His audience was late first century when the other writers, other apostles had already passed away, and John was the last of the original 12. And he's writing at a time when the primary opposition in the church was coming from a group known as the Gnostics. The Gnostics were people who were disciples of what's called Neoplatonism, or it was a variation of Plato's philosophy. And they believed that there were two realities, there's the spiritual and the natural. And in many ways, there were elements similar between Gnosticism and Christian doctrine. So it kind of made it easy for people to try to weld those two together. Now, here's the problem though. Gnosticism took away the heart of the gospel. For one thing, they believed in their construct of spiritual and material that the two realms did not cross. And so, since they did not cross, a person could not be physical and spiritual. Well, guess what? Jesus couldn't be both God and man then. And so they took away the deity of Christ, and usually they made Jesus out to be a good role model, somebody to follow, somebody, one of the few to attain to the highest level of spiritual knowledge and enlightenment, or what they call the realm of secret knowledge. And that his role now was just to set the example for us to follow. They did away with the concept of sin. Sin was irrelevant because sin was something they associated with the material or physical body, and the material body was beyond hope or redemption. So they didn't care about sin. Nobody needed salvation in the sense of regeneration or forgiveness of sin because they'd already done away with sin, and everyone was good with God in their opinion. What people needed was spiritual enlightenment. They didn't need regeneration. And so we have here with them, uh, with the Gnostics, some of the greatest challenges that John's going to face, and the early church is going to face, because they're going to be around after John, unfortunately. And even after that, even till today, we have Gnosticism in the church today. It just goes by different names. All right. So author, audience. L stands for literary analysis. So literary analysis means, are there words that we need to define? What genre of literature are we dealing with? Is imagery involved? How do we define the imagery? All of these are what's the structure of the verse itself? Or is the punctuation telling us something that we need to pay attention to? All of these are grammatical issues, literary issues, and they're important in the interpretive process. And then lastly, M. M stands for meaning. And by meaning, we're talking about the historic meaning. Looking back over 2,000 years of church history, what does this mean? Chances are you're not going to come up with some novel interpretation uh, today that hasn't been thought of by somebody else. So, what does it mean? Uh, and they will sometimes differ. The sources will sometimes differ. So, you have to look for a synthesis of their interpretation or commentary on what it means. Now, I know some commentaries can be difficult to wade through because of when they were written, style of language, and so forth. If you look online, you can find commentaries about commentaries. So I encourage you to do that as well. Now, after you've done all of that, you put all that together, that's when you can decide, what does this mean to me? And don't decide what that means to you until you get to that point. Because you may find out that there's a literal meaning in the text that applies to all of us, like a general principle, John 3:16. Or you may find that you're in reading the passage that the literal doesn't really apply to you, but there is an allegorical meaning there, or that what happened is symbolic of something that does apply to us. Like in Leviticus, most of us are not worried about keeping all the laws of Leviticus, but why were those laws given in the first place? To show that Israel was a distinct nation, the distinct people of God. Does God still want us to be distinct? Yes, He does. Now, not necessarily in the kinds of clothes we wear, but He wants us, our conduct, to be distinct in the world. So, all of the Bible is important. All of the Bible conveys a message. Our job is to find out what that message is. Remember, before you jump from reading the text to what this means to me is, there's a process that has to take place in the middle. So in the next few videos, we're going to be looking at that process. Happy studies.